it's kind of interesting, this book, and I unfortunately don't know the name, but it's basically about the so-called Q document that's supposedly the source for a lot of the New Testament Gospels. And it's just an interesting story, though, about how these scholars have sort of tried to figure out about the historical Jesus, and what was, if he really existed, and what he was like, I think there was probably a historical Jesus. I don't know. I think it's certainly an open debate, as there was because there was a Bar Kokhba, and, there was a Kaiser, and there were, although those were certainly maybe more major figures. So I think, potentially there was a Jewish guy who was, murdered like many people. But it's interesting that these scholars who are looking at this, the so-called Q or Quella, which I think means source, or is Latin for source, they put together, they said, they looked at the chronology of the four Gospels, and they said, this story is a long story. I'll just give you the short story of it, Read the book, and I'll give you the link on my webpage if you're interested. It's a good book. It's quite, so far. But they basically took, there's a lot of religions, and the origins of all the religions, I think, are interesting. But, we live under the plague and the curse of Christianity, and so it's nice to understand what exactly the origins of Christianity are, and so on. And also Judaism, since Christianity is an outgrowth of Judaism, and basically monotheistic beliefs in general. When did they start? When did they transition from the polytheistic beliefs? But what these scholars did is they looked at the four Gospels, and they quickly found out, that the John Gospel is not like the three other ones. It was, clearly came later. And so it was basically down to the three Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And so they compared those three side by side, and they realized that, instead of Matthew coming first, it was thought, that Matthew was a so-called disciple of Jesus. It seemed more like that the Mark writing came first. And so when they held the Mark writing as the first, and then they compared Luke and Matthew to it, it was clear that Luke and Matthew were basically used Mark as a source. And it's kind of an interesting conclusion that this person who writes this book has, that basically, this guy Mark was the source of all the idea of the historical Jesus, or the idea that Jesus was basically the stories of the Bible, of the New Testament. That this guy Mark was like the single source, and then that propagated the rest of the Gospels and so on. And it's interesting that they found, though, there's some other material in the stories of Luke and Matthew that are not found in Mark. And so they thought, well, what's the source of this text? And they put the text together, and it's basically all of the sayings of Jesus. And they can be separated into two basic groups. The sayings where he's like the teacher, where it's some sort of a scholarly advice, and then the other where he's talking about the end of the world or whatever, and he's more of a messenger from a God, and more of I guess it's called the eschatological, the end of the world type of talk. And it's interesting, so they basically took these quotes of Jesus' sayings or whatever as being from a different text, since they didn't relate to the Mark text. They couldn't be found in the Mark text. And I think that's an interesting comparison. And they didn't really know. They said, we think this is true, but they really didn't have, they didn't have any Q source archaeologically to prove that, or even provide evidence of that so-called genre of writing, of the group of people, followers of Jesus, who just walked around with his quotes and so on. But anyway, but then they found the gospel